Hi there, and welcome to Through the Veil, where we get together to share stories and remember the wisdom that has always belonged to us. I'm Melissa Camrudin, and this week Gemma is joining me on the podcast to share her birth stories. And the theme that arose out of these stories that I invite you to consider is the power of leaning into your knowing, that deep knowing that transcends any sort of frontal lobe knowledge knowing, the knowing that comes from your soul. You know, sometimes we get distracted by these population standard advice that we can get from our care providers, or sometimes that you carry within yourself. You know, if you're a birth worker and you know things about birth, we start to think about standards and how we should be cared for. And if this thing happens, this is what should happen. And then how what actually supersedes that is the knowing that is within a woman. And when you practice tapping into that knowing, how it actually is what makes birth safe. And you'll see this theme replayed throughout Gemma's birth stories. It's quite beautiful. Enjoy. Hi, Gemma. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome. I'm looking forward to hearing your birth story today. Tell us, where does the story of your mothering begin?
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I haven't actually spoken my second birth story out in its entirety
Oh, are you gonna?
publicly.
I
So
actually didn't
I'm really
realize there were
excited
two.
to
Are you
do
gonna
that.
tell us both?
I can
Oh,
start a little bit with my daughter, my first birth. Um, but really, I'd like to speak on my
okay.
second
Well, tell
because that
us.
was my free birth.
Yeah, feel free to tell all the details of whatever story. We have all the time.
Yeah. So my daughter landed when I was really young. Um, and but I always knew home birth was what I wanted to do. My mom didn't home birth, although I was raised really like naturally and holistically. I don't really know when I got into the realm of home birth, but I remember like in high school, even after school, going home
Mm,
and watching home birth videos. As far as I can remember, always been my thing. I think I was 15 when I was
mm,
gifted a copy of Spiritual Midwifery and was just sold after that. So she landed when I was 18. And although that was a fun surprise and there were so many unknowns, one thing I knew is that
mm,
I would be birthing at home. Um, I was living abroad at the time in Indonesia, so I kind of had an
mm,
accidental wild pregnancy, and that there just wasn't really care there that I desired or wanted to pay for. And I knew I would be coming home to Canada to birth. Um, so, yeah, that pregnancy was really, really sweet just because it was the two of us, and I didn't really know of any other option. Um, so it was just me and my baby and my intuition, and nothing to get in the way of that, which was just such a gift that even though I didn't know about wild pregnancy and free birth at that time, it's just what the
It's
universe
actually like the
guided me
most
to do.
natural thing, hey? It's for some of us, we have to be deprogrammed to know that's a thing.
Yeah.
But if you're not pre-programmed, it's just what we do.
hmm
Hmm.
I truly just had no idea going in for regular appointments when you were pregnant was a thing until I got back to Canada and wanted to get in with one of the home birth midwives who I thought were going to be
Right.
like Ina May on the farm because that's all I knew about midwifery. And yeah, I actually didn't know that I had been missing out on quote unquote prenatal care. Um, in Bali, when I was living there, I did go once for an ultrasound to confirm. But other than that, just was pregnant because I thought that's what you do.
Yeah.
And now I've returned to that realization of,
Yeah,
yes,
that
that
is prenatal
is
care.
what you do. Yeah. So, yeah, I landed back in Canada and was just so, so excited to birth and to birth at home. I came back um, about maybe about a month before I gave birth. And I didn't have a home here because I was going to move back to
Mm.
Indonesia after the birth. I just came home and asked my mom if I could birth in her house. And she was stoked for that. Um, so yeah, the birth came, and I had been
Mm.
studying hypnobirthing a lot throughout the pregnancy. That was definitely the expectations I came to birth with. It was that it would just be really, really
Mm.
easeful and gooey, and I would just breathe my baby out, and it would just be like the easiest thing ever. And so when birth came, it totally like
Yeah.
decimated me. And of course, now I'm so grateful it did, because that's exactly what I needed to, especially at that
Mm.
age, be alchemized into like the woman that she needed me to be, the mother that she needed me to be. I needed to go to that place for sure. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of, I was not expecting the
Mm.
intensity of birth at all. I think that's the one thing I wish I had prepared for, but of course it was just divinely laid out for me. Um, but I was grateful to have this one midwife who's retired now. She began her journey as
Mm.
a unlicensed midwife in a colony close to us, and she was an elder midwife, so she didn't really put up with a lot of
Mm.
Canada's midwifery
Mhm.
BS, for lack of a better term. She did do things more traditionally, which I'm grateful that she was so hands off in my birth, even though I was so young, and was really, really looked down upon by the other midwives in the practice and in the system. She really just left me alone
Mm.
and trusted me. And in the moments of birth when it was so intense and I was just being decimated, I was like desperate for
Mm.
her to nurture me. I expected her to be like rubbing my back and telling me it was all okay and helping me with my mantras. I thought that that is what a midwife did. And she didn't. She was mostly in the other room doing
Mm.
paperwork. I hardly saw her until the baby came out, and she was just a very matter of fact, hands off elder midwife, which
Mhm.
in retrospect was exactly what I needed. And I am so glad that she was so hands off, and that I was predominantly undisturbed in the process. But there was also this little girl in me that was like,
Mm.
just comfort me and make this better. And it was so shocking to me I mean, it was just so different from what I expected. So it was a long, well, about 24-hour labor, um, of me mostly just going through it alone in the bedroom in the
Mhm.
underworld, exactly how it was meant to be. Um, and her emergence was really, really fast at the end. It was about 23 hours, and then the end came, and I pushed like maybe
Wow.
twice before she was out. And that was when the midwife came in and was hands on. That's the part I look
Mm.
back and cringe on, because the labor was so undisturbed, and just like divinely perfect in its intensity. Um, but I had my
Mm.
baby in the pool, and of course was just in that beautiful oxytocin high. Um, the first moment that really, really like jolted me back into reality after that birth was 5 minutes later, the midwife saying, "It's been 5 minutes. It's time to cut the placenta." And we had talked before about
Mm.
delayed cord clamping, but we had not talked about what that was. She said, "Of course we do delayed cord clamping," and in my mind, I kind of assumed that that was as long as I wanted, or until I said when. Um, And I looked at her and was like, I thought we were doing delayed cord clamping. And she said, yep, but it's been 5 minutes. And I told her I wanted to wait. And she said, there's really no benefits beyond 5 minutes. So I'm going to cut it now. And she just reached in and cut it.
Oh.
And it was just such a visceral reaction from me and my baby of, ugh, that just feeling so wrong. 5 minutes postpartum. Um, and then they left shortly thereafter, and I had a really sweet postpartum. But I think that was the first kind of moment that really sparked or like laid the seed of me doing it
Mm.
differently the next time. Um, so yeah, after shortly after that, I was even more in love
Mm.
with birth, and so I went into a doula training, very like hopeful and starry-eyed, um, and wanting to be with women as they chose. I mean, autonomous birth, natural birth is what I was always passionate about. And so I was a little disoriented and shocked getting into the doula training, and having almost everything I was taught there go against what I
Mm.
intuitively felt about birth. Um, like in the moment, I think I could feel that I was just being taught how to be a part of a system that
Mm.
I never wanted to be a part of, but I couldn't quite articulate that. And there's just so much talk about like inclusivity, um, that I thought, and like a degradation of idolizing natural
Mm.
birth, um, and teaching students that that was like judgmental and anti-woman to try to, advise women in any way towards doing things holistically or naturally or at home. Um, and so I definitely followed that route for a little while and started supporting a lot of hospital births, um, and just came home
Mhm.
sobbing every time, every single time. Um, and of course, intuitively, I felt like something was wrong. I had never experienced this kind of obstetrical abuse in my journey, and then was taught in my doula training that at least it's a little bit better with me there. Like just
Isn't that
the
insane?
the
Yeah.
lowest
To be like, well,
standards.
if you
So I would
held the
come home
hand of your
just,
friend while they were being
yeah,
abused by their partner, it would be better. But don't tell them to leave. Don't tell them to pick
yeah, at
something
least they're
better.
not doing it
Yeah.
alone. Yeah. Just knowing there was another option, but having no kind of framework or structure or languaging around that was so disorienting. And then like falling in love with these clients as we do, being like, at least I'm there. At least I am quote unquote advocating for them because that is what we're taught to do. And then it took me like years of doing that before I realized like there really is no advocating we can do for them to save them from this. Um, and I came around like COVID times in 2020 as everybody was just getting knocked on their ass and in their beliefs and
Mhm.
everything that they thought about the world. I just came against this realization of everything I learned in the conventional doula world, everything I learned in my birth work training was just how to make
Mm.
abuse
Yeah.
more comfortable for women rather than actually letting, like, giving them the wisdom to consciously step out of the abuse themselves. And that was huge. And that was around the time when I learned about free birth and wild pregnancy and that it was even an option. I remember after having my daughter talking to my mom about it and being like, I think next time I'll just not call her. I had no idea not having a midwife was an option. That didn't cross my mind, but it was just this intuitive, like, I didn't need her there. I think next time I would just not call her. And my mom being like, that's crazy. But then when I found the free birth community, it was just like, wow, yes, this is what I've been looking for, and this is what I've been intuitively feeling, and not having any sort of a
Mm.
framework around. And then I dove right in. I didn't support a single birth in the system after that. I just went straight to supporting women who are birthing out of the system. Um, and I didn't know I was preparing for my next birth consciously, but it was definitely the most incredible birth prep
Mm.
looking back. Um, and I didn't do, at that point, I didn't do any additional training in like
Mm.
the traditional birth work, free birth world. I just sat at the feet of women who were doing it. Um, and that's where I learned. I did end up going eventually into a 2-year traditional midwifery program to learn a little bit more, but still I have only learned
Mm-hmm.
at the foot of women. Yeah, and then when I was in that journey, I met my now husband, and definitely knew that he was the father of my future babies. And when we were eventually ready to call our spirit babies in, we had uh, our first pregnancy together that went to 13 weeks before I had a loss. And that was a really big initiation in and of itself. I mean, it was my first wild pregnancy. And but then the loss happened, and it was really physically
Mm.
intense. It was like birth, but then I hemorrhaged quite severely and ended up going to the hospital and having an experience of hospital birth. Obviously, not the same, but in a sense. And I feel like that was also so divinely led, because I had never experienced that myself, and it really anchored in those years of support, like in and out of the
Mm-hmm.
system. Feel like having a felt sense of that, um, like battling the like natural cascade of hormones of birth that were
Mm.
happening, even though it was such an early birth, and like medical staff and like the absolutely treacherous bedside manner. Feeling that in my system for the first time, as opposed to somebody just supporting it, really, really anchored in, like, oh, I am
Mm-hmm.
never coming here again. So of course there was so much heartbreak there, but so much healing. And it also felt like the most incredible preparation for
Mm.
Arbor's birth, which came shortly after that. I had 2 bleeds before I conceived again. Um, and yeah, I just arrived to that pregnancy with a whole new level of trust and confidence in my body and this process and the path that I was choosing. Because I remember getting pregnant again with that pregnancy that I lost. When I found out I was pregnant, there was this moment of like, oh wow, I have been talking this talk, and now I like actually have to walk it. Like, am I actually going to do this myself? And then getting pregnant again that second time, it was just like absolutely no question or wavering. It was just such a huge level of peace. Um, yeah, that pregnancy was really, really lovely. The beginning, there was a lot of fear, of course, um, as pregnancy after loss there is. Um, but yeah, it was such a spectacular journey of just trusting my body and deepening into relationship with him and his spirit. Um, I totally was sure he was a girl the whole time. um, yeah, and I really also expected to go early with him. I went to 40, just over 40 weeks with my daughter. Um, but I
Mm.
knew this baby was way bigger. I was way bigger. I always measured like 4 weeks ahead. Um, I have a giant husband, so I thought for sure I had it set in my head I was going early. And so when 40 weeks rolled around, kind of lost my mind, which was a beautiful initiation in and of itself because I had sat with so many women who were
Hmm.
losing their mind in those last couple weeks of pregnancy, right? And then actually going through it myself was a really, really funny initiation um, of just like surrendering every
Hmm.
single day until birth was really such a gift because then when the intensity of birth actually returned, I was
Mm.
so grateful for it because I had had prodromal labor for over 3 weeks before he finally came at almost 42 weeks. Um, and so when the real thing came, it was just total ecstasy of knowing it was the real thing. And this is the thing I had prayed for all day, every day for weeks. And I'm really glad that I was brought to my edge in that way at the end because it really helped me be in a place of surrendering already, like before labor even arrived. Um, and then I also had a lot of time to face my fears at the very end. I also had an interesting journey with fears around
Mm.
gestational diabetes because it was a totally self directed pregnancy. But one thing I was guided to check myself was my blood sugar. So I just did that at home with a little blood sugar check because I had a lot of the symptoms of
Hmm.
quote unquote gestational
Yeah.
diabetes. What even is that, right? Um, but I had a lot of the symptoms and I felt intuitively guided to check that. And my blood sugars were like
Mm.
very, very, very high, even though I was eating
Mm.
well, you know, ancestrally and pretty low carb. So I am glad that I checked that just because I
Mm.
way upped my protein. And then I really couldn't metabolize any carbs, even
Yeah.
fruit would just like spike my blood sugar. Um, so I'm glad I
Were
did
you able
that. But
to like
then,
lower your blood sugars with increased like protein? Like you could manage it with
yeah,
diet? Very cool. Mm.
I could. Yeah,
Hmm.
I had to be really strict with it. And then my fasting sugars, like first thing in the morning,
Hmm.
those remained high. There's nothing I could really do about it. Um, but it just kept coming back to like,
Hmm.
well, what am I going to do about it? I'm not going to go on insulin, so why would I seek
Hmm.
further support? I'm just going to do all I can do, which is like move my body consciously, eat really, really well, um, and trust in the process. But like it really didn't bring fear to me until the very end, like getting to like 41 weeks pregnant and being like, there literally isn't any evidence that I can look at of what gestational
Yeah.
diabetes looks like past 40
No,
weeks,
they induce.
even past
Mm.
37 weeks, because they induce at 37 weeks. So then when I was approaching 42 weeks, I'm like, this is such uncharted territory. And that was
Hmm.
such an edge for me. and just knowing like this is such a big baby. Um, but I was just constantly guided back to no, everything's okay. I mean, at any point, if I felt like it wasn't,
Hmm.
and I was guided to get more support, I would have. But every time I thought of the idea, I was like, well,
Yeah,
what
what
would
do
they
they
do?
really know that I don't know?
What would
Would
they
I
do?
take what they offer? Like,
Yeah. And if I wouldn't, then what's the point in getting any
mm-hmm,
of us riled up? So that was a big edge, which I think has also
hmm,
been such a gift in my work and being able to um, walk with women as they traverse more totally uncharted territory. Um, so yeah, just surrendering to that and surrendering to I thought I would be giving birth 3 weeks ago, and here we are. um, but yeah, I had had prodromal labor, like I said, for weeks, but when I woke up in the morning, I was 41 and 6. When I woke up that morning, it didn't physically feel different, but energetically, like I could feel the hormones coming on. I just knew that it would be that day, and I was so overjoyed. Um, I remember getting out of bed and looking out the window and just like knowing so like on a cellular level that baby
mm-hmm,
would be coming that day. And then looking outside, it was October, like the most beautiful glowing larches everywhere and this huge rainbow in the view I was looking at, and just like the most inexplicable joy. Um, and I just decided to take it super slow and soften into that like flowing oxytocin. And I did, and it was amazing. I feel like although I did have a physiological birth with my daughter, I didn't tap into that level of like the
mm-hmm,
hormonal blueprint. I felt very, um, I felt very lucid with my daughter. Whereas I feel like because I just allowed myself to float away into the birth ethers like so fully and consciously, um, and only oriented towards that oxytocin in the early labor, I was just high as a kite. And it was so beautiful. I asked my mom to come pick up my daughter, who was 6 at the time, and my husband and I just went out to the forest and went for a walk as things just like slowly picked up. And I was just like gazing around us, just like gooing at like the smell of fall. And I remember telling my husband, we need to name the baby after the smell, like the smell of the rotting leaves in the fall. And it was just so
mm-hmm,
perfect and delirious. And I'm really, really glad that it was a slow build up to birth, because it was just like the most incredible honey joy I have ever felt. And then I got home and I wanted to have some alone time setting up our little birth cave, and I steamed and drummed and played music and was just praying and praying for it to get
mm-hmm,
more intense. They hadn't gotten stronger or closer together um, all day. They were pretty minor and about like 10 minutes apart, which is
mm-hmm,
what they had been for weeks. Um, I know it was different because of that like gorgeous oxytocin haze, but I was just praying for this to be real labor, um, and for baby to come. And I did, like every time I sang and prayed, they just came on stronger and stronger and stronger until I was like, whew, okay, I don't need to pray for this anymore. It is happening. Um, yeah, and it was just such a sacred space. I'm glad I had those couple hours in the den just by myself, talking to baby and in ceremony, and just like soaking up all of the joy. I remember saying, like, I can't even imagine myself calling in my husband.
Mm.
Like, I just loved that moment of being so alone. I also had a plan of calling my daughter to come back and witness the actual birth. And then I had the option of a couple of my sisters coming if I wanted them to come. But in that moment, I was like, I'm just going to do this alone. So I moved to the shower as things were getting more intense and was just in the darkness alone. And that's when things started getting a lot more intense and I was deeper into active labor. And as I descended, I just started feeling this huge sense of fear, but not like something is wrong fear. There was still like every part of me still completely trusted in this birth. It was more like a
Mm.
spiritual fear, is the only way I can put it. It was like this overwhelming, wow, like I can see the places that this birth is going to take me,
Mm.
and I don't know if I can hold it in my body because it's so fucking huge. And yeah, I just let myself revel in the fear of that for a while. I had known the places that my first birth brought me and I had seen how medicinal that was. I wasn't going in with the expectation or the desire for a like ecstatic, pain-free birth. Although I've been to those births and they're so incredible, I know that that's not where my
Mm.
medicine lies. Um, and that I really got so much wisdom from my mothering journey in
Mm.
the underworld I visited in my births. So it was exactly what I wished for, and it was also really terrifying to face in the moment. Like, no matter how much preparation I did, it just felt so big. Um, and then it was in that moment that I needed a woman to come ground the space,
Mhm.
like not even to rub my back or say anything to me. I just needed a wise woman in the space to like ground down the energy. So I called out to my husband to call both of my friends. I wanted both of them there. I needed some strong female presence in the space. Um, and as soon as they arrived,
Mm.
everything softened quite a bit. It was really, really sweet. Um, and the intensity of my waves stopped,
Mhm.
which makes sense physiologically. You know, there were new people in the space and things kind of paused. And it was a really nice pause for me to just come and be with them. They didn't even really say anything. I just said I was scared,
Mm.
and they just hummed with me and rubbed my back. And then things started to get intense again. So I just stood up and went back to the bathroom into my dark little cave. And they stayed out with my husband and just chatted and lit candles and smudged the space and played music. And I started going further and further into the birth portal. Things got really intense really fast after that. And I was mostly alone, back and forth from the shower, the hot water that felt really good, and the bedroom. Um, and then eventually I called for my husband to come in. And I just remember this moment that, like, looking back now, was transition. Being in the shower with my husband and looking at him and being like, "Aren't you
Don't you feel this?
scared?" And he was just so rooted. He just looked at me like,
Mm.
what would I be scared of? With just like so much assuredness that it just like melted all of my fear. It was just the most genuine, like, really,
Mm.
what would I be scared of in this moment? We're having a baby. Um, which is probably like one of my favorite moments looking
Mm.
back. Um, so yeah, that was around transition, and the moment when I totally met my edge and didn't feel like I could hold it in my body anymore. Um, and I also felt baby starting to descend a little bit. And then I started bleeding a lot. With fast dilation, I think, I mean, with any birth, it's common to bleed a little bit, but with fast dilation, especially. But it was a lot of blood, a lot more than I had seen at births I attended. So I definitely had a moment of fear and calling my friends in and being like, is this okay? And both of them were like, do you think it's okay?
Mm-hmm.
And just handed it right back to me, which I'm so, so grateful because, like, textbook, if you were looking at a midwifery
Mm-hmm.
textbook, that's too much blood for sure. Um, but I so appreciate their wisdom of just handing it right back to me. Because as soon as they said that, I just looked down um, and said, no, it's okay. Like there was absolutely no doubt in my mind when it was handed back to me. Everything was fine. Doesn't matter what the
Mm-hmm.
textbook amount was. Um, yeah, and like to this day, I still don't know exactly why there was so much blood, but everything ended up being perfectly fine. So I trust that. I mean, it was probably just from really fast dilation because I do remember checking myself just to see how dilated I was, and then feeling this total sinking feeling of like, oh no,
Mm.
there's still a long ways to go. There's still a lot of cervical lip. And then baby was completely descending
Wow.
maybe minutes later. So those last few centimeters of dilation happened really, really fast. And so that makes a little bit of sense looking back. But yeah, baby came right away. And it was around that like really intense transition period that we called for my daughter to be dropped off. And she stayed out in the living room with my sisters, just getting excited and lighting candles. And she would pop her head in between contractions and tell me that everything was okay. There was a moment when we were in the shower and we had been in there for a long time. She came in and said, Mama, I think you are wasting too much hot water.
Yeah, let's be
It's time to
responsible
get
here.
out. Yeah, that's enough. Um, but yeah, one of my sisters went to put her to sleep because we thought we still had a long ways to go, but it was only probably
Oh
like
my.
15 minutes after that when they were still going to bed that um, his head started emerging. It was a really fast descent as well. So we called her in, and baby's head was crowning. And then there's this really, really, I mean, it's all intense, but there's this really intense moment of feeling like as his head was descending, feeling his
Mm.
shoulder like bone on bone. A really, like it felt very wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's always intense, but in that moment, I could feel that he was stuck. I felt
Mm.
fear like in his system, and it felt very wrong. And his head wouldn't come past the
Mm.
chin. So that was definitely a big moment for me. I had had some fear of shoulder dystocia that I'd worked through in my pregnancy just because I knew intuitively this would
Mm-hmm.
be a big baby. Um, so, yeah, I had that moment of fear, and it was just another way of working with it. Intuitively, I just like reached down and felt my baby's head, and we
Mm.
took a video. So I love looking back at this moment. I was just talking to baby, being like, okay, I need you to help me out now. It's time to come out. And although I did have that like striking moment of fear when I felt that bone on bone,
Mm-hmm.
just because it felt so wrong in my system, I was really, really calm after that in correcting it. And I had a fear of just being so in it that I wouldn't know what to do in a situation like that. But of course, intuitively, I just knew exactly how to move and talk to my baby to resolve it. And it took quite a while. Looking back on the video, he was turning a little bit purple, but I just got in with
Hmm.
one knee up, the runner's lunge position, and was just moving and holding his head and talking to him, asking him to like kick and try to turn. And I was just imagining his head turning and that shoulder slipping free as I was just like rocking and swaying and alternating knees. And then he came out
Mm. How
in
long did
just
that take, like from your
one,
feeling that pressure and then?
yeah, I don't know, minutes. I mean, in the moment, it didn't
Hmm.
feel like long. Um, it was really
Yeah,
watching back the video where I was like, oh, if I was witnessing this as like an outside person, like having some training in shoulder dystocia, that
yeah.
would have raised alarm bells for sure. But yeah, I love my sisters who were there that just held the space. They definitely shared that they had fears going on in the moment, but they just held it, and trusted me. And also because I think I claimed that space of trusting me and my baby in that moment. It was like the perfect moment that he slipped out because he was starting to get
Mm.
darker for sure. And I think that was the moment where he was like, okay, where somebody's gonna have their hands on me soon if I don't get out. So um, I think he had just as
Hmm.
much of a play in like moving to try to descend as I did. It felt like a really beautiful team effort. So yeah, I was on one knee and my husband was behind me and he just caught baby and guided him between my legs and I picked him up. And like I said, the entire pregnancy, I was positive it was a girl. So looking down, like the first thing I saw is that it was a boy. And it was my daughter who called it out that it was a boy. It was like the biggest shock of my life. Just looked down at him like, who are
Yeah.
you? I don't even I don't even know you.
Like, of
Of
course.
course
Yeah.
now like after the journey we've had, I'm like, of course it was you the whole time. But just that moment of total shock, and joy and bliss. It was just, yeah, utter perfection, as it always is. This baby comes out, but especially after that really long period of intensity and waiting of him just with his chin and neck inside. It was just like the
Mm.
most ecstatic relief as he came out, and of course, everything was fine, and he breathed and cried right away. Like it was really easeful, despite him having some trouble descending. So that was really, really sweet. And my daughter was just
Mm.
beside herself. She was so, so excited. Yeah. And then we got to just be in our like postpartum
Mm.
oxytocin bliss. Like my sisters stepped out a little bit and we had our space and there was nobody in there with gloves
How long did you
asking to
wait this
cut a
time?
cord. We waited,
Mm.
I think, 4 hours until we felt guided to. I had a bit of an interesting journey with my placenta because it came out fast, about 15 minutes postpartum. It came out, but it only came out to the entrance of
Mm.
my yoni and it was
Yeah.
still stuck in there. Um, and, physiologically, that don't make sense to me. Like, what would be stuck in there? Because I tried to like give it a bit of a pull if it
Hmm.
was the amniotic sac um, still there, but no, it felt like firmly like something was still in there and attached. And of course, that didn't make sense to my midwifery brain, and it didn't need to. I just let it be. Um, and then it was a few hours later where I was like, okay, I'm really ready for this to not be like attached to the entrance of me because I want to be able to
Yeah.
like
Did you find
get
you
up
had very much bleeding in
and
that
go to
time?
the washroom and be done.
Mm.
No, it was very, very average, like nothing that concerned me. And I
Hmm.
wasn't concerned about the placenta still being attached. I was mostly
Yeah.
just bewildered because I hadn't seen that, and just like physiologically it didn't make sense. Um, so I asked my friend to help me get to the toilet. I thought
Mm.
maybe my bladder was getting in the way of it fully descending. But again, I had this placenta like
Yeah.
attached to me. So we had this very humbling moment of me like waddling to the
Yeah.
bathroom as she held it under me. Like, bless her. We became much closer. Um, so yeah, I worked on getting it out. Um, on the toilet, and it eventually came out, and intuitively I felt like
Mm.
something ripped, like there's still something in there. But I examined the placenta and there's no lobes missing, and as far as I could tell, the whole amniotic sac was there. So I
Mm.
just said okay. um yeah, so we moved on to doing
Mm.
his cord burning ceremony, which was really beautiful. My husband had like crafted this
Mm.
cord burning box from oak, and he did the ceremony with me. My daughter had gone to sleep at this point because it was about like 11 o'clock, and just him and I did the ceremony, and it was so, so
Mm.
beautiful and such a healing process after what happened with Luna and her cord. Um, yeah, it felt like such a gorgeous reclamation of it just being so slow and so private and so intentional. Um, and then we decided to cure my placenta. I didn't want to do a lotus birth because I just didn't want it attached that long, but I also didn't want to put placenta in the freezer. That felt really
Mm.
wrong to me. And so I decided to salt and herb her
Mm.
as I would with a lotus birth, but just leave her on the altar until, because it was the middle of October at that point, until the earth thawed in spring is when I buried her, which I did
Mm.
just last week. Yeah. Um, so yeah, we put her on the altar and just nestled into our postpartum bliss. It was really the most beautiful 40-day window. It was so nourished and taken care of by my husband and our community. Yeah, that postpartum was such a gift, but I didn't feel like the birth portal was closed that whole first week. I just felt like something wasn't complete. And it was very, very strange whenever I would check myself internally because I felt guided to, like, my cervix was still open,
Mm.
like very open and very low. It felt like my body wasn't letting the birth
Mm.
process finish. And then one night, um, I was dreaming about, I had this dream that all of these tiny, tiny placentas, like dollar-sized placentas, came out of me. And it was a very bizarre, like very lucid dream. And I woke up from it being like, that was really, really weird. And then I went to the bathroom, and this tiny placenta came out of me, like in real life. It was like, yeah, it was like the dream. It was like a loony sized lobe that looked like a placenta with a cord attached. And it was the craziest thing I've ever
Mm.
seen. Like, it was not a blood clot, it was very clearly a little placenta. And it just blew my midwifery mind. I'm like, this isn't possible.
Still
No?
dreaming.
It was, yeah, it was crazy. And so I talked to my midwifery mentors, and then we finally came to the realization um, that I had what they call an accessory lobe.
Mm.
So it's where you have the full placenta, and then there
Mm.
is a separate lobe, um, like attached to a completely different place on the uterus, but it's attached with a blood
Mm.
vessel to the main placenta. So I had heard of that placental anomaly, but I'd certainly never seen it and didn't expect it, right? So that was a really interesting journey of like coming to that realization of like, oh, the main placenta had released and it
Hmm.
was still attached to this little lobe that had not released
Wow. That's
from
the
my
only
uterine
thing that makes
lining.
that story make sense.
And that,
That's amazing.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was like all these pieces came, and I was like, oh my goodness, that makes sense because there's just so much confusion. I was like, why does something not feel complete, like physiologically, energetically? Um, and this was on day 7, the morning of day 7 postpartum. So I had a whole mini placenta in there for
Wow.
a week, um, which just feels like another
Yeah.
another edge I
Because
met.
all the stories say that
Um,
can happen, that you would
and
just bleed
love,
out and die, right? Like,
yeah, that you would
yeah.
die and you'd go septic. Um,
I was just listening to a birth story today at a kids' ball game, and the uh, the mama was
yeah,
telling me how they did a manual removal on her because they told her if your placenta's in for more than 2 hours, you go septic.
hmm,
And I'm like, okay,
absolutely.
I'm so sorry. Look at that, 7 days.
Yeah. So it just it feels like such a gift again for my work because I mean I never felt the need to rush
Mm,
placentas. But this felt like again that totally uncharted territory. Like there's no there's no stories or evidence on this online that we could find because they don't let it happen. Um, but also like is it because it's really rare or just because
right, we never
they
get to
don't
that
let it
point. Just like
happen?
we don't see
Like
42-week births.
yeah,
Like they're probably really
yeah.
normal and
Yeah,
relatively
with
common.
gestational diabetes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that was it. I mean, it was a really playful moment of postpartum of just like being curious and like laughing and like really questioning everything I was taught, even in my traditional midwifery training, of like,
Yeah.
actually, we know nothing. And actually, a lot of what we think we know is just totally fabricated
It's
by
also such a
obstetrics.
testament to
So,
how the knowing of a woman is the true knowing. Like you actually knew that inside of you. You had the dream
mhm,
before. You knew there was a little lobe in there that was like a
yeah,
loony. Like you knew.
yeah. I knew, my body knew. And even though I didn't have, like that framework of knowing what wasn't complete, like we
Yeah.
just know. And I can totally see this other
Mhm.
situation of if I had had any kind of care in the
Yeah.
system of how that would have gone, of like
How
a
so many pieces
D&C.
would have gone, right? Like
And
diagnosed gestational
mhm,
diabetes and what that would mean for you, even if you didn't accept it, the like type of self advocacy you'd have to
yeah,
do to maintain a natural birth or a perceived shoulder dystocia, like what the emergence of your baby would have looked
yeah,
like if someone was afraid of that and got hands in, hands on that.
totally. And just like that whole week, I was just blissed out in bed. And even though I had these inklings of like something isn't complete. If I had followed that thread to the ER
Mm,
to check what wasn't complete, I would have had a really different
yeah.
journey postpartum. So, yeah, just like so much gratitude in that. I also had an inkling of what that would have looked like because I had an osteopath who I adore come to our home and work on me and baby postpartum. But I told her she came the day that that placenta piece of placenta came out in the morning, and I told her about it because she was very supportive of my wild pregnancy and free birth the whole way through. I told her about it, just kind of like, isn't this
Mm,
amazing? Like expecting her to be like, wow, that's so cool, and it's out, and you have this story, and yada yada. And it was the first time
mm,
like that was her edge. I told her, and she just like she stopped and she was really
mm.
uncomfortable with that, and it kind of took me by surprise, and she was like, like my recommendation is that you go to the
Mm,
ER and you get an ultrasound to make sure that it's all out and you don't have an infection. And I'm like she had definitely met her edge at that moment, and I was just really confused because I felt so good in my body. I didn't have any fever. The piece was out.
yeah.
Like
There would be
the problem had been
indications if there
solved.
was more
There was nothing
problems.
else that needed to happen. Um, And she was just like, I mean, this has just never happened. And so like you don't know if you're just gonna like suddenly bleed out at some point. And it felt really um it felt like I was really seeing like the absurdity
Mm.
of the system
Yeah.
in
Thinking they
real time,
know.
of being like, there's no truth rooted in this whatsoever. Like, the problem has resolved. I am in great health. Why would I take myself to wait in the ER for hours, if I like somebody else to be scared of this situation that was like so divinely orchestrated? So that was another like really funny anchoring point of just like, yeah, just anchoring in what I knew to be true, and like the immense gratitude I had of all of these little moments that like guided me so sweetly in this journey of
Mm.
autonomous child
Yeah,
rearing.
that's the gift I think of the wild pregnancy journey and free birthing journey is your only authority is like your own inner voice. And we all have it. We all have access to that, but if you don't
Hmm.
practice it, it's hard to hear and it's hard to know if that's it. But when it's just you and your pregnancy,
Yeah.
like you're like, do I have gestational diabetes? What do I want to do about that? And you are the authority.
Yeah.
You learn to hear that, right? And then when you came through to your like all these
Hmm.
pieces of your birth, you could check in with yourself and know, and like, yeah, all women have that knowing. We
Hmm.
do. But it's hard to hear when it's being drowned out by other people's fears. And when you spent time leaning into other people's fears and them as the expert, that's a piece you lose.
Hmm.
Yeah, so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like the message that came over and over again, in both of those pregnancies, was just that like autonomous child rearing isn't
Mm-hmm.
without fear, and like wild pregnancy and free birth isn't without fear. And I'm so grateful that I could take that fear and
Mm-hmm.
work with it. I mean, the edges that it took me to felt like exactly what I needed, um, to be reborn as mother, but especially to continue on the other side of this birth into birth work and women's work. Um, it's just using that fear as alchemy, because I feel like even in the traditional birth work world, and especially like the more hypnobirthing world, there is a like
Mm-hmm.
demonization of fear, and that we need to be helping our
Mm-hmm.
clients be less fearful. Um, and I don't think there's enough talk about fear being really natural and normal and a positive, useful thing in birth. Um, I feel like even before this second birth with Arbor, there was definitely a piece of me that was trying to lead women away
Mm-hmm.
from fear. But then feeling that like immense, totally all consuming fear, and feeling that it wasn't a fear of something being wrong with my body or something being wrong with my baby, um, but just fear because threshold, this rite of passage is so, so big.
Yeah.
But of course, it's scary. And of course, all of these edges are scary. And there's a difference between fear and, hmm, what's the word? There's a difference between fear that is like
Mm-hmm.
innate and true and just part of this huge rite of passage, and then fear that is placed on you by someone else, or like lingering idea, and then letting that spiral out of control. And they feel really different in
Mm-hmm.
your body. And women can decipher what that is if they are
Yeah,
allowed
that's another
to.
practice to. Mm-hmm.
But I think just like the demonization of fear in general is such a disservice.
Yes, and of pain. That's our other one we
Like in the,
demonize.
yeah, yeah, of pain, of fear. Um, yeah, and I think we do a lot of talking about like if something is wrong,
Mhm.
you'll know. Um, and I think, of course, that's totally true. If at any of those forks I had felt like I needed additional support, I was open to that. But I think it's also worthy to note that like sometimes birth feels
Mhm.
wrong, even when it's going totally right. Um, and that bumping up against these massive fears doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong. It felt wrong in that moment when I was bleeding so much. Um, and I definitely like followed my midwifery brain of like, oh, does this mean something is wrong? But as soon as it was handed back to me, which I didn't need
Mhm.
somebody else to
You would
do,
have
I
gotten
could have
there. Yeah.
done that
Mhm.
myself. But I'm really glad I also had women who could hold that space. As soon as that was handed back to me, it was just so easy to tap into like, do I need support or is everything fine? Um, so I think it's really important for women to be telling their stories of when they were scared and did it
Mhm.
anyways. And I think that was like the biggest medicine of
Mm.
this whole journey.
Yes. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Did you decide to register the birth of your baby? How did that go?
I did. Yeah. It was pretty easeful. I had supported a lot of clients through it, and some of
Mhm.
them had a really easy time, and some of them absolutely did not. There didn't seem to be that much of a rhyme or reason. All I knew is that I didn't want to be postpartum
Mhm.
and fighting with the government. Um, so I knew I wanted to have some proof of pregnancy when I was pregnant, and I also didn't want to deal with a doctor. So the way that I got around that was I went to a naturopath and asked them to
Mhm.
order an HCG blood test as proof of pregnancy. And then I just submitted that as my proof of pregnancy, just like the
Yeah.
Life Labs results, like, as physiological proof I was pregnant. And then I went a step further. I was like, once I got out of bed, I was about 8 weeks postpartum. When I was ready to leave the house, I just went to a walk in clinic with my baby and said, like, I don't want to be seen. I don't want my baby to be seen. Can you just write a note that
Here
me and
we are.
baby were in? And the doctor
Nice.
was like, sure. And she just wrote a note saying, Gemma and baby were into the walk in clinic postpartum.
Mhm.
And that was that. So we had like the postpartum proof, the prenatal proof in a way that
Mhm.
felt comfortable for me. And it was really easeful. It came back
Great.
fine. So I'm glad I had those pieces in place
Mhm.
because I have had some clients who had absolutely nothing and have had a harder time. And I just wasn't willing
Yeah,
to
and
do
I've
that postpartum.
also know of people who felt pressured into like ultrasounds because they say that's what they want, but you really don't. Like just you can go so
Hmm.
minimal. Yeah,
You really
just like a
don't.
visit and yeah,
Yeah,
blood test. Yeah.
totally. Yeah, naturopaths can order those tests. You do have to pay for them out
Mhm.
of pocket, but
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
30
it's
bucks.
cheap. Or you can just go to a walk-in, they'll order it too. Yeah, give you a
Yeah.
get a copy from your Life Labs account. Mm-hmm. It's easy. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
tell me what sort of offerings do you have out in the world right now? And where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Wildbirth with a Y, so WYLDBIRTH. I've been kind of on maternity leave from any kind of like sharing or offerings,
Mm,
but now that my placenta is in the ground, we're 7 months postpartum. I have some new projects emerging. I'm teaching at Earth Daughters in a couple weeks from the time of recording. And then I also have a interview series coming out soon, all about postpartum, calling it the
Mm,
Matrescent Medicine Story podcast. It's not going to be an ongoing podcast, but just a series of interviews, because the birth stories and the free birth stories, autonomous birth
mm.
stories, were such incredible medicine to me in my pregnancy. And then postpartum came, and I was in this like endless, like blissful alchemy portal of postpartum that I had never heard about. And I was just like laying in my postpartum den, craving to sit at the feet of women and hear like the sovereign
Yeah.
postpartum stories. And it wasn't there. I searched for it online, of these like matrescent medicine stories, and they weren't there. So that is my prayer with this project. That's not out yet, but is. So I'll be posting it on Instagram when it's ready. But yeah, a series of interviews of women who have gone through this journey sovereignly, and the medicine stories of their matrescence. I want it to be like sitting at the feet of postpartum
Oh, that sounds
women.
lovely. I'm gonna have to keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for sharing your story.
Thank you for having me. It's been really sweet to
I loved
revisit
it.
it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. New episodes are released every Tuesday. You can submit your story through the link in the show notes or connect with us on Instagram, link in the show notes as well. Follow, subscribe, share, write us a fabulous review. These are all great ways to be part of the movement toward more powerful and peaceful births. Until next time.